also a heads up for those of us in here to know that several of our friends tonight are going to be joining from the website.
All right, well, it's your call. When do you think we ought to go?
Let's do it.
All right. All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Dana White. Welcome to the Myth Salon. Well, here we are poised to re-enter a culture where we're not going to be wearing masks as often. It looks like, in fact, Connie wrote me today and says you're going to have to redesign we're going to have to redesign the Myth Salon logo to take the masks off. This will be one of our first Myth Salons under what looks to be the new conditions. Last week, I went to Hawaii to visit my mom, and it was the first time I'd been on a plane in over a year. What an incredible trip. So today, what I'd like to do first is open it up with a moment of silence for us going forward, thinking about the people who didn't get to go forward with us, who didn't make it out of the pandemic. And hopefully this pandemic is sliding into the past. So if you will, give me a moment of silence, please. In looking for a poem to read today, and having Thompson here as our very, very special guest to connect Native American and indigenous perspectives to the climate change and the pandemic, I was struck by this little book that I dragged around with my kids when we did camping throughout the Southwest in the national parks and Arches, Canyonlands, Bryce, Zion, all of those kinds of things. And every morning we would get up out of our tents and I would read them something out of this. And they probably said, "Oh, Dad, can't we go out and climb? Can't we go run around?" Nope, you got to read one of these things every single day. So it stuck with them. And so I would just like to read a little short one. This comes out of the Navajo tradition, or the Diné. The mountains, I become part of it. The herbs, the fir tree, I become part of it. The morning mists, the clouds, the gathering waters, I become part of it. The wilderness, the dewdrops, the pollen, I become part of it. It reminds me of the oneness that I write about in interpreting the Tao Te Ching that I am currently involved in. Jonathan and I are virtually finished with this. We're on number 79 out of 81. 72 of the verses are now online on YouTube. Oneness is something that in the Western culture we struggle with. We may idealize it in philosophy or in religion, but we really have succeeded in a very big way of separating ourselves from the natural world. And it comes at a high price. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Will, who will introduce Dr. Toke Thompson, who's on the faculty of anthropology at USC. And I can't tell you how much I'm looking forward to his presentation today. So Will, thank you very much. And Toke, welcome to us.
Thank you, Dana. Hi, everyone. Before I introduce the panel tonight, I want to make two general comments about it. Firstly, we got together with all the Myth Salon panelists and agreed we wanted to try a slimmer, tighter conversation. And that having been said, all the Myth panelists that you know and love will continue to join us based on their expertise. And we're working on some additional programming that will highlight our friends like Selena and Boris and Zaman and Connie. What we're hoping for is a bit more fluid conversation with a tighter thread in these Myth Salons, as well as some increased headroom to add additional offerings. The other thing I feel I've got to acknowledge is that we're about to have a conversation around Native American mythologies with 6 white guys. I'm sure Talk has prepared his way of addressing this. What I'd like to say is that there's no intention of identifying as protagonists here. This is all about pointing to the protagonism of those who have championed these cultural narratives for so many generations. And if you'd like a deep dive into Native American creation stories told by Native Americans, the portal dedicated to Native American creation narratives can be found on the mythhouse.org event page. So earlier this year, I had the opportunity to lead the Joseph Campbell Book Club on literati for a month. And the book that I worked on was the book of his short stories. To a story, each was about how our world had become a wasteland that could only be redeemed by that which it had repressed. There were success stories and failures to integrate the repressed consciousness of country life, pre-agrarian lifestyles, women's voices, Black culture, Asian religion, and Native American beliefs. And I think this is the deal. Where our world is a wasteland is where it represses some other. And the only way to redeem our wastelands is to integrate that repressed other. In this case, it's quite literal. Where the Abrahamic narratives often convince people that the earth is a garden in our service, and Western science presents a cosmology that objectifies everything, these cosmologies expressed in mythologies have reinforced the objectification of our world, which is beneath our seeming inability to stop ourselves from bleeding this planet dry. Mythologies we've repressed, however, like those native to the Americas, resist the objectification of nature and model sustainability. This is why it's such a meaningful honor to host this conversation tonight with Toke, which brings me to our panel. You all know Dr. Dana White, scholar, host of this Myth Salon, and adjunct faculty member at Pacifica Graduate Institute. My name is Will Lynn. I'm the founder of mythhouse.org and the General Education Department at Husson College, where I teach mythology and storytelling to filmmakers and performing artists. We're joined by Dr. Dennis Patrick Slattery, a mythology scholar and storyteller, poet, and longtime professor in Pacifica's doctoral program in mythology, whose books and mythic tours can be found at dennispatrickslattery.com. We're joined by Chris Vogler, author of The Writer's Journey and former studio executive who has taught myth and story around the world for many years. And lastly, as part of our slimmed down panel, we're joined by Dr. Robert Geiker. And Dr. Geiker is a mythologist with an expertise in folklore and video games who teaches at Husson College, art history, writing, story. And the reason he teaches anthropology is the same reason I asked him to join us tonight, because when I reached out to Toke and asked him to recommend an anthropologist some years ago with a grounding in folklore who could reach our storytellers, he turned around and recommended my friend Bobby. So Dr. Geiker, thank you for joining us tonight. And if anyone's interested in learning more about the panelists, you'll find their portals on this event page, where I hope some of you are playing around with our new note-taking features. And we're also joined by Dr. Toke Thompson, Professor Toke Thompson, who will be presenting tonight. Toke is a graduate of Harvard's anthropology department, which is interesting to some of us because we know Maria Gimbutas is from there, and she's sacred to many of us as well. He did his PhD in anthropology at Berkeley and now teaches at USC. You've seen him on several series, including The Unexplained and Ancient Aliens. Thanks for joining us tonight, Toke. We're looking forward to a great conversation.
All right, good. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Will and Dana, and thanks everybody for having me here today. I am an anthropologist. I did my BA in anthropology, my PhDs in anthropology. So, you know, I come into mythology from an anthropological angle, I guess you could say. I'm also a bit of a philosopher by nature, and perhaps a bit of a concerned earthling, I guess we could say, with the state of the world today, as I think many of us are. And we're all feeling the effects, of course, of the global climate devastation. And so this is something that I've been very, very concerned about. And it intersects with my work with Native American groups, languages, and mythologies quite a great deal. So maybe just a couple of words of background about me. I grew up in Alaska. The name Tok is anglicization of a Dena'ina or Athabascan name. And I grew up in a fairly rural community that had a strong Native presence. So I am not a Native American, I'm not a tribal member, but I grew up very exposed to that culture. A lot of Native friends, babysitters, family members of mine, and I always sort of gravitated towards that side of the culture. When I got to Harvard, I was able to put that into scholarship and do that as training, and that's something I've kept up throughout the years of my training, but also my teaching. I continue to learn as I teach on Native American issues and mythology at USC. Again, I want to thank all the hosts for having us, the Myth Salon, the Houston College, Pacifica Graduate Institute seem to be very well represented in the house. So I want to send out a shout out to everybody who has helped put this thing together. And again, I realize that this is very often a different sort of approach. There's often a religious studies or a psychological approach, maybe a bit different than the anthropological approach that I would pursue. So as an anthropologist, I tend to be concerned with cultural diversity, what is different about cultures, what is different about different cultural approaches. And I'm also concerned with equity, with creating a just and fair world, and certainly a just and fair United States of America. So what I mean when I talk about mythology, I've worked on this quite a great deal. I have a couple of books out on the topic. One sort of a textbook called The Truth of Myth, which you can really get into what at least I and many other scholars mean when they say myth. So the idea that myth is a sacred story. Some people have talked about it being a fundamental story or sort of an existential narrative. Like without this story, I would not be me. My world would not be my world. That brings us to the core of myths. They're sacred, and they're sacred to people, to individuals. People feel the sacred quality of whatever myths they follow and believe in. So for my view, to understand cultural diversity, understand cultural differences, different worldviews, differences of opinion, one of the best ways to get to the core of that is looking at the diversity in mythology. And again, this interest in Native American studies comes together with my interest in Native American mythology. It also wraps up with a great deal of my interest in the climate devastation. That is sort of the background to how I came on to this topic. And let me see if I can get my PowerPoint presentation going here now. I should be ready to go. There we go. So my topic that I alighted on in discussion with the people here at Myth Salon is how understanding Native American mythology can help save the earth. And I mean that absolutely literally. There's a lot of things we need to do, of course, to save the earth, but I believe that this may be a key way forward. Okay, so mythology creates the way a culture categorizes, considers, and acts upon the world. And so the understanding of mythological diversity can help one understand the different approaches, different possibilities, different ways forward. Let's see here. Should be able to. There we go. I see. So this is my sort of definitions and starting points. I've done, again, I grew up in a very, very rural area in Alaska. I grew up part and parcel of a lot of Native culture. And again, I've studied this and kept up with it for years. And some of the things that may seem commonplace to Native Americans might seem very strange or hard to describe for non-natives. So for example, let's take this quote. Nowadays, look around, animals are insulted. They might go away forever. This can happen. It's not like when I was a child. People don't understand animals anymore. People who have to go among animals out on the land, they still understand. What does he mean? He means this. When you're talking about insulted animals, maybe going away and not coming back, this is what he means. So we're talking about the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is the scientific name given to the current situation. And the current situation is that the Earth, planet Earth, is going through the 6th great extinction of life. The last one was about 72 million years ago. It was because an asteroid came down, slammed into the Earth. This one is not caused by an asteroid. This one is caused by us. Homo sapiens sapiens, and that's why we get that title, the Anthropocene. So this is ongoing. It's been ongoing in terms of my life. In the course of my life, most, over 50% of wildlife has gone extinct over the course of my life alone. So this is something that's happening in our lives, and this is something that is simply on a massive scale. We're not talking about American culture. We're not talking about even human culture. We're talking about life on a planet that is being severely attenuated for the sixth time now in our generation because of us. So this is really, of course, concern to everyone, and it impacts everyone. It impacts not only us, but of course, it impacts life on Earth itself. So the word, the Anthropocene, it's a handy word because it reminds us that we are the ones in cause of this. Unlike the Holocene or some of these other nomenclatures, this one reminds us we are the cause of this. We are causing Earth's great extinction. However, a couple of people pointed out that you have to be careful using that word because it's not all of us. It's not all of us equally. Some people are much more the cause of this. Some cultures and societies are much more the cause of this. And it's clearly the Western culture, industrialization is the cause of this. So who isn't the cause of this? Well, indigenous people, for one. There's other people too, but certainly indigenous peoples are not the cause of the sixth great extinction. They're not the cause of global climate change and global climate catastrophes. So global indigenous peoples then make a really important group to consider of how not to continue causing this. If they figured out a way to live sustainably, then perhaps we could learn from them. And that's really my starting point to this. And they have, for example, there are many examples. For example, the Haida Gua up in the Haida region in Northwest Coast, archaeologists and anthropologists have put together the picture that these same community, the same people have been living in the same lagoon for some 12,000 years. 12,000. So, you compare that to the history of the Americas, what is it, 250? I mean, 12,000, you're getting up to the beginnings of agriculture anywhere in the world. And these people have figured out how to sustainably be there, having, wonderful creative lives, dancing, art, music, all the rest, without destroying the environment, without having to pollute it. And so that's just simply one example, but you could see many different examples. And these are the same groups that were looked down on historically by Western viewpoints, and who were the recipients of all sorts of atrocities, genocides. Many of them were unrecognized. Very few people are aware of the California state policy of genocide that was funded by the U.S. federal government, for example, in the 1880s. Most people are unaware that Native Americans, slaves, continued long after the Emancipation Proclamation. So there's most people are unaware that Native Americans had vibrant societies, civilizations. Most people are unaware that most Native Americans were farmers living in agrarian villages and even large cities at the time the Europeans arrived, not hunter-gatherers. And also, they're unaware that even this term hunter-gatherers makes it sound as if they were just sort of in the state of raw nature, wandering around gathering. Not at all. We know that there was, not agriculture as we would talk about it, but this idea of protecting the environment, enriching the environment, nourishing the environment through, if you had a favorite tree, you might weed around it, you might get other plants to bring other plants to join it. So very often people from Europe would not even know that they were in a Native American farm because it didn't look like a farm. And they still don't look like a farm. People can often go and be amazed at the abundance and diversity of life around traditional Native American settlements, not realizing that Native Americans created those environments, not farms, but rather just amplified the possibilities of life there. So there's a lot that is undiscovered or unknown or unrecognized, and even when we know it, there seems to be great reluctance to investigate or to get to understand that. So right now, again, just as sort of a reminder, the trajectory has not stopped. The trajectory has not slowed down. And if this has been over the 70% in just 50 years over the course of my lifetime, you can do the math. What's the next 50 years going to look like unless something radically different happens? And very often when people are trying to figure out a way out of this, they'll turn to technological solutions. If we only get that next solar panel, if we only figure out that next battery. And yet people who have given their whole lives to these have come to the realization that it's really not enough. There is no technical solution. Some people are like, oh, just plant more trees. They've done studies. We can't plant enough trees to offset the carbon that we are producing. So rather than technology offering us some fix, it seems to be the heart of the problem. So this is, again, a very, very major thing that all of us are facing in terms of our children, our grandchildren, the future of our society, and even more than that, the future of humanity. Even more than that, again, the future of life on Earth. Okay, so one of the things I investigate when I look at myths is that myths aren't just simply stories from long ago. They do things in people's lives. People rely on these stories to make sense of the world, to categorize the world, and to know what to do, to make judgments and decisions about what to do with the world. So for me as an anthropologist with a very strong interest in mythology, these are the core narratives of a culture. They are sacred stories, very often of how the world came to be, but in doing that, they set up, here's what the world is, here's what the categories are, here's what you should understand. And then along with this, then they're a charter for everyday life. Given that this is how the world was formed, this is how you should act. And they're done radically differently in different societies. So to understand these, I think that to understand somebody else's myth, one has to understand one's own. This is true with anthropology in general. If you want to understand another culture, you really have to understand how culture has shaped you. And then you have a bit of an idea. So if you look at the myths that are most common certainly in the Western civilization, a lot of the world today is the Abrahamic myths. The creation of the world, creation of people, creation of animals, how did everything come to be? There are some very, very powerful narratives in the Abrahamic religious traditions that convey a great deal of messages about what the world is. And these are, of course, shared with slight variations, but shared with all the Abrahamic faith, with Judaism, with Christianity, and with Islam. If you spin a globe, you'll look at it, look at how much of the world is covered by one of those faiths, either officially or unofficially. So these very often pass under the radar because they are so prevalent. When we think of myths, we very often think of other people's sacred creation stories. But again, to understand another person's different view, one has to understand one's own. So comparatively, if we look at Abrahamic myths, we can notice a few things, and I've just outlined what I think are some of the three most striking things, two of which I'm going to focus on here. In an anthropological and comparative sense, Abrahamic myths are notably anthropocentric. Anthropocentric means that it's all about humans. Humans are the center of the universe. It's all about us, center of the world. The world was created for us. We are the agents of the story. And even the divine is human in form. Right? God made man in his image. This idea that we've always been here, that not only is the world about us, but even the entire cosmos. Also, Abrahamic myths, in a comparative sense, looking at them compared with other myths around the world, are notably androcentric. Men are emphasized, as is women's subjugation. The first person was a man. And in fact, the divine entity of the being is God, the Father. It's very often a male image. There is no sort of mother goddess in the Abrahamic tradition. Now, some people might take up one, but in the story as it is, there is no mother goddess. So it's very androcentric. It focuses on the male. Now, already, hopefully you can see where I'm going with some of this, that not only is this in the story, but it's in the culture. Right? Our Western society has been very anthropocentric. It's all about people. It's also been very androcentric. It's a very patrilineal and, in general, patriarchal culture. So again, hopefully you can see where I'm going, that these myths are not just stories from way back when. They really shape a lot of the ways that people engage with the world. Finally, I would say that in comparison with a lot of other myths, and in comparison with Native American myths, these are notably cosmocentric. The divine is located not in the earth, but away from the earth, up in the heavens. God is up in the heavens. Good people, when they die, go to the heavens, not here. All right, so it's cosmocentric. So these are three major sort of facets or distinctions of Abrahamic mythology. I think I went too far here. Oh no, there you go. And again, you don't necessarily have to be a believer for these to impact you. I mean, this is my Adam's apple right here. Whether or not I'm a believer in the story or not, if I went to med school, I'd have to know that's my Adam's apple. So these things permeate our culture. They permeate all sorts of things: our language, our worldviews, our philosophies. So the idea of the anthropocentrism, we can notice that there really are no active animals in this story except for one, the serpent or the snake. Christian traditions usually associated with Satan, the ultimate evil. So the only animal that has any sort of agency in this story is representing absolute evil, and is also the reason we die, right? So that's bad, right? So there we go. And then finally, I'm trying to focus on this one, just the idea of cosmocentric, that it's up, right? The living on Earth is a punishment. And then good people, when they die, get to rise up or perhaps even ascend when the time comes. So Earth, by comparison, is very mundane. There's nothing holy about the Earth. There's nothing holy about other animals. Other animals in the Christian tradition do not have souls. They are mundane. So even if we might be 98% the same DNA as a chimp, we have, they have 0% souls, and we have 100% soul. So there's a very binary distinction there. Okay, so that's just a very swift overview to some of the themes in Abrahamic ones. And I'm doing this to provide a point of comparison. So if you contrast that with Native American myths, there's a few things that really leap out at you pretty easily. Number one, most of the Native American myths do not have a human-like creator. Most of the creator figures are animal figures of various sorts. That might not seem like a big deal, but it actually is. It's this idea that animals were here before us, that they are our elder brothers, our creators, our teachers, and therefore we owe them a bit of respect as ancestors, and that they are regular animals running around are filled with spirit, have souls, are people in that sense, are soulful beings. Now, if we look at also, there's some other distinctions, like Coyote is a very, very common creator figure, but you can't really compare him with Jehovah. Coyote is absolutely no Jehovah. He's not setting up the world according to some plan or to balance a sense of good versus evil. It's not about that. It's not good versus evil. He's a trickster. He creates things. He's generally a good guy, but he's motivated very often by human fallibilities, greed, lust, petty grievances. I said human fallibilities, but again, we can also imagine that these might not just be our fallibilities alone. So he is a great representative of the trickster figure, someone who slips between the human world and the animal world, does all sorts of crazy stuff, usually gets punished for it, doesn't get away, but he kind of springs back to life like the wily coyote. And this is a predominant theme. This slippage between the human and the animal realm is more than any of the specific stories. It's this theme that I really want to highlight. So tricksters in general have a strong role. They very often create the world, and again, do so not usually with the best of intentions, but motivated by greed, lust, curiosity, what have you. These can include figures like the raven and coyote, but many, many other figures in different groups will fit into these same roles. And their creative acts also, they don't necessarily create everything, but they'll create different aspects in different stories. Some create mankind, some create the world, lineages, gender, marriages, all sorts of other fundamental qualities of life. One common story that I think deserves mention, sometimes called the Earth Diver myth. This is where land comes from, the creation of land. Creation of land is usually not done by these trickster animals. It's not done by a coyote or a raven. It's usually done by an aquatic animal, a beaver, a turtle, a duck. And an animal, the idea is that in the beginning there was only water, there was no earth. And then at some point, as water animal, all the animals say, hey, we need land. Why don't you go down and try to do this? And the animals, several water animals tried, and this one we're seeing an otter, a beaver, and a muskrat. It's a muskrat who eventually succeeds. He comes down, he gets a little paw full of dirt, swims back up to the surface, plops it down, and then from that small little piece grows the rest of terra firma, the rest of land. So this is the Earth Diver myth. Again, sometimes it's played by the muskrat. If you go over to the Algonquin groups, it's played by the turtle. And you might have even heard North America or the Americas talked about as Turtle Island. This is how a lot of groups refer to the Americas, going back to this cosmic story. This is a pretty widespread sacred creation story or a myth. And again, we see it pretty much, in a variety of ways through a wide swath of Native American groups. Let's keep going here. So as I like to say, myths are never confined to these stories, not in our culture, not in anybody's culture. Rather, myths are constantly being enacted throughout a society, throughout a culture. And it's enacted by individuals. People ask what myths mean. As far as I know, the only place where meaning exists is right here. We create meaning. We have neurons and synapses, and this is what gives us the experience of meaning. So this is carried forth by individuals. And again, it impacts all sorts of things in one's daily life. My cup here is another instantiation of that. I don't know if you can see it, but this is the trickster one. This is detailing that moment where Raven releases the moon. Again, it shows up on coffee mugs, it shows up on drums, it shows up on clothing, it shows up on moiety signals and lineages, what lineage you belong to, what your clan is. And these are not at all ancient. Well, they are ancient, but they're also very contemporary. Native American traditions are not extinct. They are not done with. They are not over. They are very vibrant traditions. Just a little photo. Again, this idea that animals have souls. Now, many Native Americans hunt. So what is that? You're killing a soulful being. I've been on a lot of hunts with both native and non-native, and it's sort of interesting. You can engage in an activity and you quickly realize that there are two very, very different conceptualizations of that activity going on. For the non-natives, hunting is a mundane activity. You're shooting a meat berry, taking it home to feed the family, leave the rest for the squirrels. It's a mundane activity. For Native Americans who also hunt, it is not a mundane activity because an animal has a soul, has a spirit. You are connected to it. You must pray for its spirit in the afterlife. There's all sorts of funerary rituals depending on the group, depending on the animal that has to be engaged in. So it isn't mundane. It is a very, very charged activity. So again, one thing I want to look at is there's a variety of stories, and you could go through all these stories. There's wonderful stories. But there's also some prevalent themes that come out. So again, Native Americans, this is even if you're just looking at North America, we're talking over 300 languages, over 80 language families, radically different societies, everybody from hunter-gatherers to settled city dwellers, patrilineal, matrilineal groups. So Native American societies and groups are far more diverse than, say, European societies and cultures and languages. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. But even as you go through these, you do notice that certain themes really jump out, and they can be sort of locally placed and have a lot of local impact. So I've just selected 3 to try to illustrate this point. I could start maybe by the one over to the right here, The Man Who Became a Caribou. This is a recent book by Craig Mishler and Kenneth Frank. I had the honor to review this, and wonderful book. It is presented bilingually. It has a tremendous range of stuff all about the caribou, but it centers on one particular story, and that story being the man who became a caribou. In this story, the Gwich'in people were struggling, not doing very well. But there was a man there whose spirit animal was a caribou, and he joined them. He went to live with the caribou, becoming a caribou for a while, learning of their ways. And then when he came back to his own community, he said, "Look, here's what they need. Here's our relationship. Here's how we should work with them." And this sets up kind of an ethnogenesis. This is what creates the Gwich'in people. They are the caribou people. They are focused on the porcupine caribou herd. This is their main food stuff, as well as the stuff of their tools, clothing, and very much so today, by the way. They're up in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. This is an area that is constantly under threat from petroleum development. Okay, so moving over to the Haida. I mentioned the Haida before. This is a group that had lived in the Haida Gwa area for some 12,000 years without messing things up. and very, very rich artistic and community lives. Salmon Boy, somewhat similar in the sense that the story is that there was the Haida didn't quite know how to deal with salmon, and there was a boy who was mistreating them, even took a couple of salmon out of the stream and just let them die, even though he wasn't going to eat them. He wasted their meat. As a punishment, the salmon turned him into a salmon and said, "You're going to live with us for a while." He lived with the salmon for many years and was swimming upstream when he was landed by a fisherman, and his mother or grandmother recognizes him by the little amulet he has on him there in that picture. And at that point, he turns back into a person and says, "Okay, here's how we're supposed to live with salmon." All right, this is a mutual aid society that we have. Slightly differently, but again, that same theme, white buffalo woman. This is a very, very important secret creation story for the Sioux and many of the Plains groups. In this group, they're already around again. They don't know how to behave. They're sort of uncivilized at this point. And then white buffalo woman comes to them almost sort of a messiah figure, sort of reformulating their society, telling them how to do things. And she is both a buffalo and a woman. She changes back and forth, and she instructs them again their proper relationship with the buffalo. Again, we're seeing the theme here that in each one of these societies, the primary animal, the primary species that they interacted with, that they had to utilize and harvest, became the focus of these creation stories. These animals and their relationship to them is really what made them them. Right? What it is to be Gwich'in, you can't really be Gwich'in without the man who became a caribou story. Salmon Boy is essential in what it is to be a Haida. A white buffalo woman is essential to what it is to be a Sioux. So again, we're looking at essential narratives. And we see the same theme. It's not just a slippage between the human and the animal, but rather a base of a reciprocity. And with that, this acceptance of what is often called animism. The idea that other animals, all life has a soul, has a spirit, is an agent. It can decide, it can think about things. This has long been derided in Western scientific views. Sometimes you read mythological texts like animism was the childhood of religions. This was even put forward by a child psychologist. So Jean Piaget described the animistic stage of psychology. That, in other words, this is a sort of childish belief that one should learn better and give up. Okay, so it's sort of interesting that in the last few years, and last year, not when I was an undergrad at Harvard, I couldn't talk about this stuff, but in the last few years, Western scholarship increasingly recognizes this dismissal of animism as a fundamental mistake. What I mean by that is that we're getting this tremendous rush of scientific evidence documenting the intense mental, cognitive, and communicative world in which we live. We are not the only communicating species. We're not the only species with language, that is to say, socially learned communications. When I was an undergrad, it was man, the tool user. And then Jane Goodall figured out chimps, and now we figured out that ravens use tools and make tools. We even have fish using tools. All right, so tool use has been on Earth for millions of more years than people have. The idea of linguistic communities, different whale pods can't really understand each other because they're speaking different languages. We even have examples of animals, for whatever reason, picking up and learning the languages of other species. So we think we're very clever that now we're figuring out how to learn the speech of other species. Other species have been doing this for a while. So this has really been a revolution in a lot of scholarship, biology and humanities. I mean, again, the words humanities. We generally tend to work maybe in a humanities department. I'm in an anthropology department, right? So when a dolphin saves a baby or something, we might say, well, what a humane thing to do. Maybe it wasn't a very humane thing to do. Maybe it was a very dolphin thing to do. Right? This idea that a sense of ethics, a sense of morality, all of this we find outside of our species, increasingly documented. And this is happening in like some of the very sort of staid journals, like Animal Behavior is now filled with references to animal traditions, animal culture. So this has created a whole rupture in Western discourse, and it's a very interesting and exciting rupture. It's a sort of one of these correctives that is sweeping through all of the disciplines, sometimes lumped under the animal term, and we can even go a bit broader than that. I like the term post-human. And by post-human, we're just sort of questioning what we mean when we say human. Is human, what is it to be a person? Is that the exact same thing as Homo sapiens sapiens? And again, going back to that notion of the soul, a lot of people believe in the soul. This is what creates your sort of personhood. Do animals have souls? So this is a great deal of change going on. And all of this, again, it's really cutting edge stuff in the Western sciences. This would all be sort of old news for Native American societies. This is their worldview. And this has long been their worldview because their myths set out that the world works that way. I'll just give you a couple of examples. So like octopi, right? So there's an octopus city found off the coast of Australia. Octopi are very intelligent, playful, incredible mental abilities of octopi. And yet they're more closely related to snails than they are to humans. And so where it does this is, in other words, it may not just be how close to humans you are, rather this seems to be very broadly spread throughout and differentiated differently throughout the living life. And even if you want to go further, some very, very interesting new stuff has been coming out about how forests think, how forests communicate. And again, this is not coming out from the new age side of things. This is coming out from science, from people who are professors in soils and in forestry. And so we now know of last just couple of years that forests communicate, plants communicate, they remember, they feel, they have knowledge, they have social knowledge. Trees will often communicate with their surrounding neighbors, surrounding kinsfolk, if they're being attacked by herbivores and alerting their kinfolk to release toxins or oils to help repel them. In the middle of a forest, if a big old tree is cut down, the plants surrounding it will continue to supply it with nutrients. And what do they get? They get information. They get information from this old growth tree. And so we can observe this. We don't quite know what they're saying, but we can observe these packets of information being passed throughout a forest. And fungi seem to be doing a lot of the deal of the communication bearing. Again, this is all very, very new stuff. We don't really know what it is exactly. We don't quite know what they're saying. We know dolphins are speaking various dolphin languages to each other. We don't quite know what they're saying, but we know they're doing it. So that's about how far we are. And again, we are coming to the point where we can reassess our earlier dismissal of animism. Graham Harvey, I really, really respect his work. I highly recommend it. He's been at the lead of a lot of these concepts, and he's been calling for academic animism, as he likes to put it, which is a recentering of much of the anthropocentric mindset of science towards the living world. How do we incorporate these ideas and these beliefs and this knowledge that we are living in a communicative world? How do we sort of incorporate that in our scholarly approaches in our Western science? And these concepts grow from insights and inspirations found in many indigenous worldviews. Graham Harvey's very aware of this. He knows he's not making this up from whole cloth. He's learning from all of these different indigenous groups. And you can, how do you learn about worldviews? You can observe them. You can look at daily practices. You can look at all sorts of things. But perhaps at the core, again, the mythologies, which set out what is sacred, what is a soul, what is a spirit. So this is sort of, it's also being addressed on a vernacular level, I think, in America, so stepping outside of the native realm for a moment. Now, again, in the Abrahamic discourse, and according to the official theology of the church, animals do not have souls. The answer to this is no, right? And yet, people seem to be engaging with this a great deal. So if you see some of these little Facebook memes I picked up, type yes if you believe animals have souls. This sort of stuff. And it's sort of interesting statistics that today in America, most people who believe in souls believe that the animals have them as well. So I'll give some statistics down there. So this is sort of an interesting shift, I believe, even in the sort of lay perception of what it is to have a soul, what it is to have a spirit, and with that, what it is to be a person. I didn't put the slide up here, but there's been a major case extending possible legal rights to Happy the elephant. based on her self-recognition and self-awareness. She's been suing for habeas corpus, and it has been initially granted for the first time ever in the United States. It might get struck down in appeal, but we can still see that even legally, things are beginning to shift in America. So just to sort of underline this point, again, Native American sacred stories repeatedly underline the idea that our spirituality is part and parcel with all the rest of life. This is the spiritual side of animism. It's not from the heavens. Heavens don't really have a place in Native American mythology. They show up in a few things, but that's not where the sacred is at. But going on from the spiritual side, if you believe that something has a soul, something has a spirit side, then this very often influences ethics. What does a society think is ethically right? And in terms of ethics, if you accept the idea that animals do have spirits and agency, or in a sense, persons, this means that it is one's personal spiritual duty to defend them, to defend the living world, to defend biodiversity, to defend healthy ecosystems and species. It's not just a pragmatically good thing, like we need a healthy ecosystem so we can breathe. It's also on a spiritual level. It's also, this is a spiritual wrong that is being done to the world, not just a mundane wrong. Okay, so this means there's one duty to engage and respectfully acknowledge the non-human others. So again, this sets up a different path for thinking about our relationship to the world, thinking about our relationship to life on Earth. In Native American traditions, and again, a wonderful, dizzying diversity of Native Americans. And so I'm trying to get a few common threads, and some of the common threads are, I think, very interesting. Number one, animals are people. They don't mean that animals are Homo sapiens sapiens. That would be ridiculous. They mean they're people. We're the campfire people in the Dena'ina traditions where I come from. We're the animals that build campfires. The beavers are called the chewing people. They're the ones that chew a lot. So, but we're all people. All right, so this idea of personhood becomes a very interesting thing to focus on. Animals have souls. And again, that was forever, that's been a very fundamental disjuncture between the Abrahamic approaches and the native approaches. With this, humans are enmeshed in ethical and pragmatic relations with all of their lives. And finally, my summation that such spiritual outlooks accord with a sustainable relationship with the natural environment. So this has practical impacts, practical effects. Native Americans are the poorest ethnic group in all of America. They're the most disadvantaged by any measure you can take. Least access to healthcare, highest suicide rates, biggest chance of being shot by police, poorest group. And again, this is all their country just a very, very short while ago. This is not ancient history. This is very, very recent history. So it's also interesting with all of their other issues. Many of them are trying to reclaim their languages that were stolen from them in the boarding school movement, fighting the impacts of poverty and all of this sort of stuff. And with all of their difficulties facing them, one of the interesting things to me is how much time and effort they dedicate towards environmental causes in trying to ensure that, that the Earth is healthy. And it's not about getting their fair share. The Dakota Access Pipeline, they were not out there saying, hey, you owe us some bucks for this. Not at all. And in fact, for example, in this example, this tribe was offered $1 billion for putting in an LNG pipeline through their territory. The whole tribe is living beneath the poverty level. This would have made all of them millionaires. The tribal chief who was called up about this proposal said, look, this is so big that I really need to put this out for a vote, a plebiscite, a referendum of the entire group. They did, and they unanimously turned down the offer. I know Trudeau's government thought they had this all worked out. They thought it was going to go, and no, it didn't. What's the follow-up, you might want to ask? Well, they put in the pipeline anyway and didn't pay them anything. So Native Americans are in the lead, very often in the lead, of the fight for a sustainable planet, while at the same time being some of the most frontline victims of the Anthropocene. What I mean by that is, especially those Native American groups that are able to continue their subsistence lifestyles or their traditional lifestyles. Many of these societies, many of these places are very, very healthy communities. And they feel pretty good that they can continue indefinitely, except for one thing, and that is climate change itself. Especially if you go up to the Arctic. I'm from Alaska, a lot of native groups, and the impacts of climate change are so very, very noticeable up there, far, far more than even here in LA. And you can think about all the fires we've had, but it's just simply is not even the same state that I grew up in, not the same physical environment that I grew up in. And that has a tremendous amount of impacts for people who have learned for millennia how to work with that environment. So they're paying the price for the Anthropocene more than anyone. And they are not responsible for the Anthropocene. And with that, they're doing this, and again, they're not doing that just to make a big show. They're not doing that to ask for their fair cut or to become millionaires. They're doing this because of beliefs about what is sacred, what is one's spiritual and ethical duties. And again, we find the sources for our ethics in mythology. Let's see here, there we go. So, if you want to support the planet, if you want to support biodiverse planet, the simplest thing I can say is support indigenous rights. Support indigenous peoples. Are they going to do everything right every single time? Well, probably not, but they'll probably do a lot better than the non-indigenous. And plus it was all their land a short while ago. So that's one thing you could say just in terms of pragmatics, politics. There's also a lot of knowledge in indigenous groups, traditional ecological knowledge, how to use different plants, how the ecosystems works. This is all also very helpful knowledge in trying to make a biodiverse world in the future. But this is sort of practical stuff. Again, if we're trying to understand why these people feel the way they do, why they have the ethics the way they do, then we get back to those core narratives. Then we get back to the mythology itself. So Native American myths are ongoing, contemporary, vibrant traditions, which are radically different in fundamental ways than Abrahamic myths. Particularly regarding the spiritual and ethical relations to the living world. So again, a lot of people sometimes think of ancient myths, we're talking about ancient history here. Not at all. These are, for many, many groups, very, very contemporary traditions, very, very contemporary sacred narratives, and they're still very sacred for many, many people. They still really set up the world for many, many native groups. So here's where we're at. We're sort of in a competing myths, as I like to think about it. Indigenous peoples, if you look globally, again, my expertise is really in Native Americans, but of course they are a part of the global indigenous, and this is a global issue. Indigenous peoples are about 2% of the world's population. On the other hand, if you look at those lands that they've still managed to control, that's over 80% of the Earth's biodiversity is in Native America, or in indigenous lands. So again, if you want a biodiverse future, the simplest and most direct advice would be support indigenous rights. And the conflicts, again, they're about land, they're about water, but they're really about the sacred. They're really about ontology. Who am I? Am I just a person and completely divorced from this world? This world is mundane. I am soulful, or are we all in this together? One way I like to think about it in terms of ontology, this idea of who am I? My lungs need plants to work. I breathe out, the tree breathes in, the tree breathes out, I breathe in, right? That's the carbon oxygen cycle. So I like to think of trees as my other lungs. They are also a part of me. They take that and they give it back to me. How long would we last if the trees suddenly disappeared from planet Earth? Not long, a few minutes maybe. And we are losing the trees on planet Earth. That's another thing to consider. If you look at, say, Brazil, to the current government, the devastations against the Amazon have been encouraged and are increasing. We are rapidly increasing this trajectory towards a very, very hard landing soon. So one way to think about it is sort of a mythic competition, a competition between two myths. Is your sacred, animals, life, or is the earth mundane and we are sacred? And we belong perhaps in the heavens, so we're going to pay for, like, I don't know, space travel, rockets to Mars. We're all going to fly away in a tin can and leave the earth behind. This is a big fantasy. You see it in a lot of our TV shows, a lot of our popular culture, this idea that salvation is going to be in a tin can floating through space, and the earth presumably is left behind to die. That is not sort of a Native American pop culture tradition either. Right? It does not emanate from that. For Native Americans, this is where the divine is, the material world. This is where your soul goes, right here. This is it. You know, and if we so you look at this picture, I see this as a competition between those core narratives. I see this as a clash of myths. Okay, so just to sort of conclude here, and I want to thank you again for all your time. How to heal the earth? I believe we can begin by learning better how to listen. What I mean by that is acknowledging difference, acknowledging the different approaches, and being able to learn from them, being able to understand, again, not just how Native Americans use their myths to make sense of the world, but also how we have made sense of the world via our myths. And how has that been working out for us? Right? This idea that, you know, we are in this simply by ourselves as Homo sapiens sapiens is probably the main rhetoric that has gotten us to this situation. And this situation is, again, rapidly approaching a wholesale collapse of life on Earth. If your children ever see a wolf, your grandchildren, I wouldn't bet on it. A butterfly, wouldn't bet on it. So many species have gone extinct, even in my lifetime. So are there people out there who have a sense of what needs to be done? Yeah, and again, indigenous peoples are in the lead, not only on the boots in the street, you know, standing in front of water cannons and rubber bullets to try to defend life on Earth, but they're also in the lead in conceptualizing it, thinking about it, giving us stories that make it explicable, show us how life is connected and interconnected. Okay, that's about it. I am very much looking forward to the conversations, and some of the, again, I've been working on a long while with lots of different threads. I've tried to sort of pull them together here under this rubric of how Native American mythology can help save planet Earth. So thank you, everybody. I still my voice and wait to hear the voices of others.
So thank you. I don't know how you pulled off a masterclass in 45 minutes. Thank you for showing us the importance of myths and stories to who we are and what we do, for showing us how our Western myths ground our unsustainable ways, and how Native American myths and worldviews can help model a better world. And I wanted to start by asking Dennis. Dennis is often focused, for those of us who are with the Myth Salon often, on the way we can live within our myths and the relationship of myths to our lives. And Dennis, I'm wondering if you had any reflections around Toke's discussion of the myths we've been living and how we might write our narratives.
Yeah, and Toke, thank you. That was just a brilliant presentation. And you touched on so many areas. I mean, this is how synchronicity works that I've been working on. Where I am right now is, and one of my favorite classics to teach is Melville's Moby Dick. And I'm preparing lectures for a small retreat on Nantucket Island in October, where it'll be, I'll give presentations on Moby Dick in the morning, and then a colleague from Pacifica who grew up on Nantucket will be taking us into the natural order. And so we've got this resonance between the place and the birthplace of whaling. But at the same time, just to stay with what Will asked, I went back and have been spending a good bit of time reading James Hillman's magnificent essay, Anima Mundi, Returning Soul to the World, which is in book 6 of his uniform edition entitled City and Soul. And, you know, I'm thinking about Queequeg. I'm thinking about the name of the ship, the Pequod, from a northeastern tribe that I know you know about. And I'm thinking about Melville's prescient poetic vision of how what was taking place in industrial America in the 19th century, publishes it in 1851 when Melville is 32, which really flips me out every time I think about that. but he saw that the myth was exhausting the earth. He saw that the whale was in some rich symbolic way the world soul, the anima mundi, and to hunt it down, even to the point of extinction, is in a sense to desecrate, if not assassinate, the human soul in its rapacious greed to industrialize and commodify nature into barrels of oil on the try-works on the ship, and then bring them back to New Bedford in the United States to illuminate lanterns, the bones for corsets, the skeletons. In other words, to dismember it, to fan it out into a cultural commodity. So I want to present and revision that epic in terms of his relationship to Queequeg, the son of an island chief, whose body is fully tattooed with an entire cosmos done by one of the shamans of the tribe. And at the end of the epic, excuse me, as many of you know, Ishmael, quoting Job, I alone am escaped to tell thee of this story. He's lying for 24 hours on the lifebuoy coffin. I mean, this is just brilliant poetry and brilliant mythology. And on the top of this coffin that was Queequeg's, but when he recovered from his illness, he caulked it and it replaced one of the lifebuoys that lifebuoys on the ship that had deteriorated. So Ishmael spends a night and a day lying on this coffin lid that has engraved a replica of the tattoos on Queequeg's body. So here's my myth fantasy. When the ship Rachel, deviously going back and forth in a herringbone pattern, seeking the captain's son who was lost in one of the whaleboats, he comes upon, the captain of the Rachel comes upon Ishmael and pulls him up to return him to land to tell us the story that we're just finishing up. My fantasy is that on Ishmael's body is the imprint from the carved surface of the myth that we need, and that all of what gathers around Queequeg and so many of the things that you've just pointed out are snagged into that new mythology. So I just wanted to share that with the group and with all of the members here in the panel, because I think Melville already saw it in the middle of the 19th century, how the industrial garbinator, the industrial dragon that can never be satisfied, is alive and loose in the world. So that's where I am. And any response from you, Toka, would be wonderful.
Well, thanks for that. That's a very interesting perspective. And just as a response, I can think of a few things. That I love your fantasy of the sort of the imprinting of mythology on the body, because again, that's sort of what mythology does. It's imprinted on us in all these very often unconscious ways. We carry it around with us even when we don't know that we do. And then also, what is the whale? I mean, you saw the image I shared of the Yupik hunters with the whale that they had killed, little beluga whale that they had killed and were standing around praying for. So whaling is a very interesting thing. Go up to the parts of Alaska where they do whaling. A lot of the indigenous groups hunt whales. And they're able to do it, and it's a big part of the tradition. It's a very mythologized practice. Again, these whales are very, very spiritual beings. They respect them. They feed the whole village for the year. And so it's the again, the harvesting of a whale is sort of so radically different in the native world. But I do want to sort of mention one thing, because it reminds me of something. And I've talked about how native groups are so often on the front lines of environmental action. And yet in my field work with them, and I've grown up in those communities and I've spent a tremendous amount of time, one of the most frequent complaints is like, who is making your life difficult for people who are leading subsistence lives? And the number one person, the number one group that they will very often point out is environmentalists. I can give you an example. There was a couple of years ago, it was a 16-year-old boy in a rural village who landed his first whale as a whaleboat captain. A huge honor. This is not an easy thing to do. They come out with these little boats and going against a whale. And he was very proud. He fed the whole community for a year, very proud, but he posted it on Facebook. And he was getting death threats. He got horrible death threats from even the president of Greenpeace, who refused to back down. And so there's a huge irony here, in that you would think that Native Americans and environmentalists would be the best of allies, but too often that possibility fails.
Well, you point out something else, and then I'll be quiet so others can speak. But that last vignette of yours is a wonderful way to think about how an organic mythology can deteriorate into a cadaverous ideology. In other words, it gets fixed. It's, the hand's not open anymore. It's a fist. And, this myth that used to be alive and well and flexible and breathing has now been reduced to a cadaver, which I call what happens when a myth becomes an ideology. Yeah, that was a great example you gave. Thank you for that.
Dennis, you brought in Moby Dick, and you mentioned healing the world's soul. For Hillman, for those of us who know him, we know soul is made through the narrativization of our lives. Soul is made through the way we tell our story about ourselves to ourselves. And so healing the soul of the world, which is the motto of Pacifica, to me has always meant healing the narratives of the world and the narratives we tell ourselves.
Yeah.
So Chris, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the role of storytellers in helping us to heal our cultural myths.
Well, sure. Yeah, all these things that Toke has been opening up for us, revealing for us, are coming in the form of stories. And, you can feel some of the healing power in these things, just from the simple short descriptions even. One thing I observed was in your three examples of the man who became a caribou and the salmon boy and the white buffalo woman, all those sound to me like shamanic stories. The kind of event that happens in someone's life where this is part of the Native American tradition, as I understand it, that at some point you go and seek a vision, and you sort of participate in that shamanic world, even if you're not a professional shaman, by going and seeking a connection, usually with some animal who you present your problem that you have personally, or that the society has, the tribe has. And the ultimate objective of this, or the result usually, is that you go into some kind of a trance where animals start talking to you and relay some information and give it back to you as a story or a dance or a song that you bring back to your people for healing. And what I'm curious about, Toke, is this is, as you say, a living mythic system. And I assume then it must be continuing to evolve. And one thing I'm curious about, as you painted, I don't think you're exaggerating at all, we're heading towards a catastrophe. But the Native Americans have been there before. They have been through 200 years of catastrophe. So I wonder how their myths have evolved to take this into account, and what do they have to say by way of warning, I guess, to us? So how are they continuing to develop these myths?
Yeah, it's wonderful, wonderful questions, and I'm really glad you asked them. Yeah, you know, the idea of shamanism, I thought, well, do I want to go? Then I thought, for the sake of the talk, maybe I just wouldn't, because, and because as sometimes people say that, in a lot of groups will say, well, everybody's a bit of a shaman. It's just people we call shamans are the ones who really, really specialize in it. So yeah, you're absolutely right. This is shamanism, the vision quest. These are part and parcel of this view of animism that everybody would take part in. So everybody was doing shamanism to a certain degree, maybe not to the degree of, like you say, the professional shaman, but everyone was to some degree involved in this. You know, and the man who became a caribou, they make it explicitly clear in that story that, number one, it so happened that caribou were this guy's spirit animal. So this allowed for him to enter their world and become their world. So you've got things like shamanism, you've got things like the vision quest. These are all parts of the traditions, parts of the cultures, but they're wrapped up in this wider framework of animism that is readily apparent, readily understood by just about everybody. Now, a lot of these traditions have been snuffed out by colonists. There's, you know, incredible genocides against native peoples. A lot of languages are lost. A lot of entire tribes have been wiped out. And then, of course, there's been a great deal of forced assimilation via the boarding school, particularly, and forced Christianization. So many Native American groups were forced to change their religions and forced to change their religious beliefs. And I also like what you point out, that if you want to understand, like, what an apocalypse is like, you know, sci-fi writers are often running, what's it like to go through an apocalypse? Go talk to the indigenous peoples. They'll tell you what it's like. They know exactly what it's like to lose everything. So they're you know, they're I think a great resource on that. And yeah, their mythologies are today, they account for that. They are in reaction to that. They are in concert with that experience. And let me say too, with the Christianization, it can work very interestingly, because I know a lot of people who would consider themselves to be good Christians, but are also clearly good animists. This idea of someone who could go beyond the realm of the dead and come back to life, the Jesus Christ story, and heal people. For many Native Americans, it's like, oh, this sounds like a great shaman. We like shamans, right? So there's a great deal of interpenetration of these traditions too. Many people who would consider themselves Christians would also believe the animals have souls, pray for the spirits of the animals that they killed, offer funeral rituals, right? So these things very often continue, even with the influence of Christianity and with the influence of the modern day. I'll give an example. I had a wonderful guest speaker come to my class at USC a couple of years ago. He was from the Pine Ridge Reservation, Lakota, and he did the Lakota origin story, the sacred creation story of the world. Did the whole, pretty much the synopsized version of pretty much the whole thing. He brought his sacred drum and his PowerPoint. And for, you know, your PowerPoint images, there's a time of the monsters. So he put up images of dinosaurs. He's like, there you go, there's your monsters, right? He put up images of, you know, there was a time of the flood, so he got some images from the Noah Ark tradition, right? Completely different tradition, completely different story. But, you know, he's able to use these images to get the point across, I think, to students particularly. And, you know, was it a Native American creation myth? Absolutely, absolutely. But it's updated. And that's also, I maybe I should say something about that, because the other thing you can notice about the Abrahamic text that I didn't go into, and maybe I should have, is that they're written, right? The myths are written. There's a book, and the idea of being a people of the book, of being God is the author of the book. There is no sacred Native American book. There's lots of Native American sacred stories. You can write them in a book, but that book isn't sacred. You know, you burn a book on Native American creation stories, nothing bad's going to happen. Right? You burn a Bible expecting lightning or something. So that's a big difference, because where are these Native American myths? Where do they exist, if not in a book? They exist in performance, in live performance. And live performance as a folklorist, you know, it's always updating. You know, you tell a joke today that, you know, you're going to change it, you're going to update it. And the same is true with these mythologies. So these mythologies are always being updated, always being made increasingly relevant to the day that we are living in. And of course, that also includes the increasingly relevance of global climate catastrophe. So this has become a part of these stories for many groups.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. You know, by way of a follow-up, I wonder how they are dealing with how do you reach people who just don't get it? Your slide that showed the oppositional forces of, this armored personnel carrier and, facing off against the teepees was, something that summed it up. And not even talking about people who are violently opposed to your views because they want to put it in a oil pipeline or something, but even well-meaning people who just don't get it. I'll give you an example. I live on the edge of the Bologna wetlands in Los Angeles. It's a nature preserve, and it's dotted with Indian burial sites. And they made an honest effort to try and do something to commemorate that. So they made an activity center for kids to go to, and they said, let's build, I don't know exactly the term, but a wiki up of the type, a kind of a dome-shaped shelter. But the health inspector came in and the fire inspector came in and said, if you make it out of the native materials, it will rot, it could burn, and rats might get in it. So the compromise was the committee got together and they made one, but they made it out of stainless steel. So how do you deal with that? But both the people who are really armed against you, literally sometimes, and certainly supported by legal and political forces, and even how do you deal with the people who don't get it in another sense, that they mean well, but they just don't know how to implement it?
Yeah, that's a tremendous problem, and it's something that I've dedicated a significant portion of my life to combating. I teach every semester on a large lecture class on Native Americans for USC, and the biggest struggle I have is to get students to care. Why should I care? What can I learn from Native Americans? We have it drummed into us that there's absolutely nothing we can learn from them. Right, and that's part of the American story. It's a part of cowboys versus Indians. It's a part of how the West was won. And so there's a great reluctance to look. It's also about this idea of progress, that we are progressed because and that's better because we have like atom bombs and things. And then they are not progressed, and that's worse because they don't have atom bombs. Or your example, right? I mean, part of the whole point of the architecture is it's supposed to be biodegradable, right? That's part of the point. Yeah, it is a real issue, and there's a lot of history involved. There's a lot of politics involved, and what can I say? It's about education. It's about learning, and it's about trying to get the word out.
That's great. Thank you.
I can also just say that right before I hopped on board to this talk, I was at a meeting for 2 hours with the city of Los Angeles called. What was it called? Beyond Land Acknowledgement. And it was about exactly these issues of how do we actually do something significant here in Los Angeles, particularly for the Tongva groups, who are not even federally recognized, state recognized, but not federally recognized. So, some of these Tonga people were like, look, we're home. I'm homeless and it's my own land. How can I be homeless in my own land? So there's a tremendous amount of things to be done, to be sure. And that is the single hardest thing I have to get across. Like, what could we possibly learn? And yet there's so much, and there's so much that I often tell the students when they come in the class, this is a much harder class for me to teach, the class on Native Americans, than most of my other classes. Because in most of my other classes, I'm delivering you brand new information. But in this one, I'll spend half of the time getting you to unlearn what you've already learned, because it's wrong.
Gosh, I'm just so moved by by the comparison of stories where we put ourselves in the position of our prey versus stories like Hercules, where we kill all the evil animal monsters. Such a different world, such a different set of stories, and such different stories that help us get the world in different ways. Dr. Geiker, thanks for joining us. I'm really curious to know what you've been thinking about.
Oh man, well, I have to first say that I've had the good fortune of being at many panels that Toke has given at different conferences. So, but I really have to say, Toke, this was really quite a moving and very brilliant presentation. I just wanted to first acknowledge that. I mean, I really enjoyed this. One thing I think, as I was thinking about, entering into this material, I think this is a really great opportunity for perhaps us to hear a bit of what you think are some of the advantages of the methodologies that are come from anthropology and from folklore itself. I think one thing that you obviously kind of embody in this way is the idea of listening. That was one thing that really struck me right near the very end of your presentation. The folklorist, much like the anthropologist, but I do want to suggest here that there is quite a difference here. In anthropology, you know, we often discuss, you know, first off, there is, like you mentioned, the Anthropocene there. So it's a very kind of become kind of human-centric or anthropocentric, as you would say. But in folklore, I think there's an interesting kind of a juxtaposition there of lore, of knowledge, handed down knowledge, and folk. And always the thing that folklorists, you know, we're always kind of talking about, well, who is the folk? How do we figure out who the folk are in our conversations and in our field work? And I'm reminded of the work of Barry Tolkien, kind of like the other Tolkien, not the Tolkien, but the Tolkien. And Barry Tolkien, who, you know, unfortunately we have lost in recent years, just in 2018. He really dialed into this kind of message. I think he brought home the point that we should consider when we work with our groups, that we consider them not just informants, as has often been the case in the history of anthropology, but we consider them as partners, as kind of collaborators, contributors to the work that we do. And he was very much involved. You know, I would actually really like to hear a bit of, you know, if you could share with us maybe what you recall from that kind of that famous kind of infamous paper that he had about the yellow man tapes. I think that would be a really great example of what it would mean to kind of shed light on folklorist's approach to anthropology. So that's where I kind of want to start. I mean, there's many directions that it came up for me in this conversation, but I think I just kind of want to start there, and then I'll maybe kind of see what comes up later on.
Great. Well, yeah, just to kick that off, well, thanks very much. And Barry Tolkien, for people who don't know him, was a folklorist who dedicated his career to studying the Dene or the Navajo traditions, particularly religious traditions. Wonderful work. So the word informants. I prefer the word teachers because I'm learning from these people, right? When I listen, I learn. And so you can learn from everybody. I mean, everybody as a folklorist, that's the other thing you get is that everybody is a universe, right? Everybody has a story or multiple stories to tell. So I always like to think of myself as a perpetual learner, and always sort of, rather than informants, I seek teachers, people who can tell me a thing or two. And Barry Tolkien, I think, was a great inspiration to me in my own work, and the way he was able to really try to get, you know, into the Navajo worldview of how things make sense. That it's difficult sometimes. You have to learn a little bit of the language. Not the easiest language to pick up. The Athabascan or Dene language family is a notoriously complex language. Beautiful, but very complex. And it takes years. You can dedicate years of your life as a folklorist to spending with one group even. And yeah, so with the one you're referring to is a yellow man who is a medicine man or shaman for the Dene, and he was Barry Tolkien's teacher. And for a lot of, and he taped him for years and years. And then Yellow Man unexpectedly died. And there was an interesting question of what to do with all these cassette tapes that Barry Tolkien had taped. And there was some people said they should give it to the museum. Some people said they should give it to the tribe. Some people said they should give it to his family. But he was really concerned because Yellow Man never told him what to do with all these tapes. But he did say that some of these stories could only be spoken. Those words could only be spoken at particular times of the year. That it can only be spoken in winter, or they can only be spoken in summer, and that it would be an abomination, a curse, a cosmic bad thing for these voices to be uttered at the wrong time of the year. And that becomes a problem if you have cassette tapes sitting in a library somewhere. How are you going to police that? And even if you give it to the tribe, how is he going to police that? So he had to sort of wrestle with his faith, his conscience, and in the end, he destroyed the tapes. because he thought that was the only way to protect what Yellow Man thought was the right thing to do. That was he got a lot of flack for that, right? Even a lot of Navajos are like, "Wait, we don't have those. He was the last storyteller. We should have him." A lot of museums are like, "Hey, that's good stuff. We should have him." So it was a very contentious thing, but ultimately he had to decide, and he decided that based on his understanding of Yellow Man's ethics. And I think that's a great model, that we have to really take seriously people's ethical beliefs if we want to live in a just world. It's not just about what I think is right, but about what other people think is right too. And the more voices we can get involved in that conversation, the more just world we can create. So yeah, that's a great example to put forth.
Yeah, that's really terrific. I mean, one thing, I mean, from my a little bit of the process I went through through my grad studies, our good kind of shared mentor, colleague, Paul Zolbrod, who taught our Native American classes at Pacifica. There was a moment where we were learning about the Dene and their Dene Bahane, the story of their creation. And there was a particular work also about the mountain chant, I believe it was. And, I grew up in Albuquerque. And when we study mythology, you go in as a student. I'm kind of giving a bit of a student perspective here. The first thing you kind of think of sometimes, and this is why I think I really, appreciate your kind of take on moving us outside of, into non-Western categories of what mythologies are to non-Western kind of ontologies and of life ways. We often look to the Greeks, and I was, trying to figure out, Hesiod, Homer, what did they have to say about the myths, the Greek myths, the classical ones that we know as, often children still learn in America as like the mythology, the Greeks, you start with them. But then it was funny because my imagination carried me off outside of where we were in California, off to this land of the imagined Greeks. And then I recalled as I was reading this particular mountain chant, the two kind of twin heroes kind of going around this particular, racing around this mountain. I realized those were mountains that were right around the ones I grew up by. And I remember that it did this little shift in me. It was very subtle, but it was a little shift. And I realized that mythic landscape is in and around us. It's not in a place that should be kept off in discourse and in imagination, that it's actually embedded in the very environment around us. So I just wanted to share a bit of, that kind of moment I had. The other thing that kind of really struck me also is this idea of decentering and the listening again, coming back to that. Something about that I think that I've often learned quite a bit as I've kind of listened to, especially from the Haida stories that you were bringing up, the myth tellers of Haida. There's this idea that the animals are given a proper name. And I think that's quite different as opposed to the Aesopic tradition sometimes where the animals are considered to be illogical, but it's the humorous satirical usage of animals to give morals. It's a little kind of a different shift. And one thing I think that really struck me about this was that in the Haida tradition, we learned that the myths actually come from a non-human, almost from the wild. It's the voice from the voice of the wild, of the animals, of the myth world. And it struck me as this kind of word is vicarious. And, I find that there's something in there about, what we were mentioning about the shamanism and how to kind of get ourselves out of the human state and to experience a perspective, often like what Will was beginning to jump into there. This idea that we just need to start to develop this capacity to shift out of the human perspective into the non-human. And maybe that is a place that we could get to with our technology in some forms, thinking of, VR, ways that we can try to imagine new paradigms of thinking, kind of like using some of our media. So I'm not sure if we'll get there tonight, but I was also kind of had in mind maybe perhaps for our storytellers in the audience too, what we could possibly do in our pop culture and in our forms of media too. I have examples on my mind, but, also want to, kind of give more space to the conversation too. So I think I'll stop there.
Okay, well, I'll try to respond to that. Thanks, Robert. That was some really great examples. Let me start, I'll kind of work backwards, if you will. The whole idea of tech. Yeah, Native Americans are not anti-tech. This is really my experience. I mean, they're anti-Anthropocene, anti-climate destruction, but they're not anti-tech. There's some wonderful examples of computer games that have been developed by Native groups to, elucidate their sort of sacred beliefs. There's a lot of these sort of things. Native fashion. I really think that native fashion is very interesting because fashion is all about what people are going to be wearing like next year, right? It's all about the future, and so native fashion becomes an interesting thing to look at. The single best thing that helps strengthening native languages today, after all the decimation of the last 100 years, is YouTube and Facebook. All right, so this is enormously, even the mythology is really being spread a lot through technology, through the internet. So again, these are not, it's not that Native Americans are opposed to technology or that the mythology is opposed to technology, not at all. They very, very often utilize this, particularly digital technology, because the wonderful thing about the digital technology is that it allows people to get their voices up there in a way that the printing press and that whole industrial culture industry did not. Right? If you weren't going to have a big seller, you weren't going to get a book at all. Well, now anybody can put up, what they want online. Doesn't say everybody's going to read it, but you can. You can also just skip right over that literary phase. A lot of people who speak native languages don't write them. The native languages are mostly still an oral medium. Linguists can write them, but most people don't. They're still an oral medium. And that used to really be difficult then to get those stories down and in print and distributed. And now it's so easy. You can whip out your iPhone and say, hey, Grandpa, tell me that story again, right? And Grandpa tells a story and you click the upload button and boom, there it's uploaded. So this is actually the digital technology and the development of the internet and the sort of democratizing aspects of that have been an incredible boon to Native American revitalization in many, many ways. So that's a great point. I think that it needs to be brought up. I think I mentioned the Lakota speaker with the sacred drum and the PowerPoint before. Right, these things work seamlessly well together. Going back to your earlier thing, this idea of mythology, and people think of Greeks. That also becomes something I have to struggle against when I teach mythology classes, because people come in thinking, oh, mythology, that's ancient Greek stuff. And ancient Greeks, one question we could ask is like, why do we keep using ancient Greeks as sort of this exemplar of mythology? And we do. If you go around college campuses, you're always going to find some kind of, Greek mythology class. Very rarely would you find a native mythology class, in spite of the fact that native mythologies are going on right now, sometimes right next door to the university. Right? So why are we studying ancient Greek mythology? Well, I think you all probably know the answer, because the Greeks are the origins of Western civilization, the birthplace of, in other words, it's an origin story itself. By focusing on Greek mythology, we are engaging in telling our own origin story. And it's a really sort of bad example because most of the information we get about Greek mythology was not written by practitioners, even people who knew practitioners. Most of these practices were already long over when people were writing about what people used to do or what people used to believe. So the data set we have for Greek mythology is abysmal. It's poor. It's a poor reflection of what the actual mythic life of Greek myths would have been. And also, one last problem with Greek mythology is it's very, very similar to Abrahamic mythology. It's anthropocentric, it's androcentric, and it's fairly cosmocentric, not quite as much maybe, but I mean, Zeus is simply Deus, it's simply God. The Romans called him Zeus Pater, or Jupiter, where we named the planet of it, basically Father God, right? So you still have a Father God who either is up on Mount Olympus or up in heaven. That's not that big of a leap. So if you really want to understand cultural diversity in mythology, the Greek exemplar is a very, very bad one for Western society. And instead, we could view it as a part of a myth-making process in which we like to tell ourselves, again, that our culture is sort of natural or the only way or the only game in town. Greek mythology is wonderful stuff, but so is every mythology. And so the emphasis we give to Greek mythology is really, again, our own origin story. And the fact that we emphasize that means that we're just simply emphasizing our own origin story again and again. And then place. You mentioned place and mountains. Yeah. So yeah, place. And Daniel, you mentioned even in your initial poem the idea of place. And so I was thinking of that when Robert was speaking. And one of the things about, for example, you have the four mountains which sort of create the boundaries for the Navajo or Diné territory. And even the language that I am learning, Dena'ina, where I come from in Alaska, long, long ways away, same language family, the Athabascan or Diné language family. And so even in places, if you look at places, don't show up in the same way. We in Western society, we name something like, I don't know, Bear Mountain. You wouldn't do that in these languages. Places aren't just things, they're spots where stuff is going on. So it's always verbal. A stream rushing down between two rocks, right? And so it's even hard to translate because we have to put up something else like place where a stream rushes down, right? We have to put in the place, but it's not there in their languages. It's action. And so this is linguistically a very, very different view of place. Is it a thing or is it happening? I'll give you another example. In Diné languages, they really de-emphasize nouns in general. And there's a couple of Native American language families that have no nouns. There are no things. There's no stuff. There's no objects. There's only verbs. Stuff is happening, but it doesn't exist outside of happening. So I didn't go too deeply into languages, but of course, languages and mythologies are also very entwined. And to understand a mythology, you really want to take that part and parcel with understanding the language. So yeah, that's the response I had to those. But yeah, excellent and varied points, all of them. So I appreciate it.
Just a quick follow-up. I'm just curious. One thing that also kind of came up for me as I was listening to your talk, mythos in Greek, not to be, going back to the Greeks again, but mythos itself is kind of like this sense of just speech, like a very kind of like authoritative speech act. Classicists kind of really focus on that kind of combing through what Homer's usage of mythos meant. And then we have Plato's, and it kind of shifts again. I found it kind of interesting that what we're getting at here is the idea of not speaking, that perhaps we need to kind of shut up a bit and listen. And I found that kind of muting a bit of the mythos, kind of bringing it down a bit, muting as opposed to the speaking. One thing I would like to ask.
Sorry, Robert. But Robert, as a focus, like you don't speak by yourself. You speak with an audience. You speak with a group. So to have social speech, you have to have listeners, right?
Right. Yeah. So that's what I was thinking of. It's like this idea that we need to shift to audience rather than to being in the front and center. The other thing too was with the groups that you work with, in language-wise, what is the term that they would consider? What is their term for the stories? What are the genres that they give it? The native kind of category for their stories.
Yeah, one unfortunate thing is due to some of the, I think, very Western-centric research done on mythologies, a lot of them don't like the word anymore. A lot of them would avoid the word myth. So I think that myth is a fine word. I think we can use it, as you point out. It has roots back into ancient Greek as a narrated practice, as distinct from logos. So mythos versus logos. So I still think it's a very, very useful word, and I think it's too bad that it has developed such an unpalatable connotation for many Native groups. So they would tend to say things like sacred stories, right? And that covers it, I think, or even creation stories. Or sometimes they're genre differently, like coyote stories, right? So it's all the ones about coyote. You can package stories differently, of course, but it is too bad that, I'm hoping to sort of revitalize the word a bit to where people feel comfortable in using that word to discuss these really powerful existential narratives. But yeah, listening. So if I guess one last thing about the listening, and I'll just give you an anecdote. Again, I grew up in a kind of a mixed community, and I had to take the school bus. And it was a long way to get to the school from where I lived. I had to go several miles to get to the pickup spot, and then every morning, rural Alaska, it'd be an hour and a half ride on this little school bus. And it would be a mix of Native kids and non-Native kids, and the Native kids would always sort of laugh at the non-Native kids of how chatty we were. We were just noisy, and I started to realize that was a real sort of cultural difference. you know, if I get in an elevator, I kind of feel compelled to make conversation, like, oh, nice day we're having, right? And I realize this is a cultural expectation that is not widely found in Native American ones. And I think one of the reasons is that, again, in this animistic perspective, what you say is you're putting your thoughts, your spiritual attitudes into the numinous world. So words have impact, words exist, and you have to take words very seriously as a Native American, as an animist, that you are, you know, you're moving into a spiritual realm and you're contributing it to it. So you better make sure that contribution is a good contribution. And if you come at the idea of speech from an animistic perspective, it makes sense to think very, very carefully about what one says.
Toke, I'm struck by what you just said here, that in the West, what we seem to live and die by are these projections. And it's as if we have made ourselves in reference to something that existed a long time ago, but we've lost the ability to engage the world that we're actually in. And so we have these kind of dead concepts that are sort of orienting ourselves, that we want to build upon and make the world and reshape it in that image. But we don't really understand what it is that is around us. And so we're stuck with the way that we've learned ourselves how to be. And so the only way that we can get to that other place to imagine who we were before we became this way is to unlearn that entire process. And I think that's what these Native American traditions and indigenous traditions can teach us, because their whole existence is based upon engagement and being in the flow, in the moment, understanding. It's rather like the Tao, where they have to read it in the moment when it's alive and connect with it in a field of oneness. And so it seems to me that sustaining themselves as they have for all of these centuries, our modern attraction to them is trying to recapture something we lost a long time ago. Maybe you'd respond to that.
Yeah, it could be. There's certainly, I think, a lot of people in nostalgia for living in a more harmonious way with nature. I think for many people find that an attractive potential. You know, we're even setting aside global climate catastrophes that are unfolding. But of course, that lights a fire under all of our discussions here. The fact that we are sort of quickly running off a cliff. You also touch on this idea too that I think is really important, that it's writing. We really believe in writing, right? And so the idea of the script, but what writing does is it freezes a performance at a particular moment, and then people look at that 2,000 years later and it hasn't changed. And so just that act of writing is radically different than an act that gives primacy to that performance, performative moment. And one of the things that we can see in all types of folklore is that, again, it's adaptable. You can always update it very, very easily. Whereas if you have a text, it's not easy to update that text. A lot of people would feel very strongly that one should not update that text. So simply that idea of writing sets it up very distinctly. And it reminded me of something else too. And I'll just, again, going back to this idea of like, well, what can we learn from Native American peoples? And I think there's so much, but I'll just give you one example, because again, we tend to believe in our own Western mythology to the point that it impacts even our scientific discourse. I talked a little bit about that with the humanities and post-humanism, but it's really everywhere. Let me just give you a quick example. So you might, pick up popular psychology and read some study, and it might say something like, 52% of males are 52% more likely to lie about an extramarital affair than women, something like that, right? And then this will be scientifically done with large surveys and stuff. And so you could argue about whether it was a representative survey. You could argue about the sample size. You could argue about the questions. But it's presented as this is what we're discussing. What is overlooked? Oh, what's overlooked is, why are there only two genders? Right? I mean, we don't even talk about that. Oh, men are more likely, women are likely. Well, we have this story where God created two genders, Adam and Eve. Most Native American groups, all the Native American groups that I'm aware of, acknowledge more than two genders. Some acknowledge five. And this is, this is kind of so again, we think, oh, it's just science, but we forget the fundamental underlying questions of the categories that we are opposing. How are those underlying categories being opposed? What are those underlying categories? And again, if something like this is a big deal in America today, a lot of people are sort of wrestling with ideas about, non-binary gendered people and, what do we call them? How is this going to work? And it's like, guys, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can look at Native American societies. They've been doing this forever. They have categories, they have names, they have traditions. And it also has practical effects, because if you've probably been aware that there's all these new legislation trying to ban transgender athletes, including in states like South Dakota that have very, very sizable Native American populations that have always acknowledged more than two genders. So this is the ongoing colonization, and it's the ongoing power of myth, and it replicates itself in many, many ways, and prevents us from maybe understanding the world in as holistic a way as we could. And again, myths are distillations of cultures thinking about things for thousands of years, and there's a tremendous opportunity, I believe, to learn from them. And I think that's certainly what I'm trying to do in my career: learn from them. How can we learn from them?
You talk about these patterns beneath.
Oh, no.
Will, you go ahead.
Okay, sure. Okay. Well, we're talking about these patterns beneath the stories, and there's one that's been on my mind as we've been talking, and we're talking about cosmocentric, and one that's on my mind is just immanence versus transcendence, and which is the idea that the world, the divine is here with us versus the divine is out there, and with the distinction between immanence and transcendence, also the tradition of asceticism. And asceticism, for those who may not be familiar with it, is this idea that the soul has fallen into the body, and that the body is in a fallen world, and that the world and the body are corrupting the soul. This is seen from Socrates, from the fall of Eden. In Hinduism, it's seen all over the world, and it's in conflict with religions and traditions that don't separate the body and mind in that way, and that recognize an immanence. And we talk about how so many Christians actually do believe that animals have souls. And I'm thinking a lot about the fact that, Celts believed that nature was divine. And so there was this real conflict that Campbell pointed out when Christianity's coming into Europe and saying the world is fallen and your body is corrupt and it's ruining your soul, and that animals don't have souls. And the Celts are like, what are you talking about? And so we end up with a European version of Christianity that has integrated some of these elements, even though we don't kind of acknowledge where they come from sometimes. Go around to a cathedral and you see green men everywhere. They're not part of Christianity, but they're in like every cathedral, and there they are representing the immanence and the divinity of nature. And so I was just wondering if immanence and transcendence and asceticism was of interest in the conversation for you.
Yeah, so you really touch on some really big divergences in the cultural mythological traditions there. So in a lot of the Abrahamic traditions, it's the world is a problem, the body is a problem, it's sinful, it's not good, right? We're trying to get out of here, go up to the heavens. That's where things are good. And again, I think this explains a lot of why we spend so much money going to Mars and not so much money, exploring the depths of our own oceans or even our own soil. So this actually has like a lot of real, impact. But we're looking at sexuality, which is another sort of thing. I mentioned gender, but sexuality, the idea of shame and sexuality. This is really very often centered in the Garden of Eden story, the forbidden fruit, and then God says you're supposed to, and then they cover themselves and they're ashamed, and so there's this idea that to sin, right, that sex is somewhat sinful, at least if you do it wrong. That and to sin, you're sort of breaking the commandment from God. Well, what happens if there's no commandment to break? Right? A Native American tradition, Coyote's not saying not to have sex. No, Coyote's trying to have sex with way too many people, the wrong people. right? You learn from what he does wrong. You learn from the time he tried to seduce his mother-in-law. He should not have done that, right? But this idea is not that the body is the problem, not that the earth is a problem, more or less the opposite. This is heaven. This is as good as it gets. And there is no sin, because you're not sinning against anything. There's no God to tell you what not to do. You can do like unproductive stuff, but so there's no sin. And so even the emotions that one might feel, you're not going to have that sort of sinful shamefulness about sexuality. You can have other emotions, and again, it can be dangerous, it can cause problems, but you know, what is it to be in a body? That's a good thing in Native American traditions. Bodies are good. Life is good. And so again, it creates a different way of even thinking about, you know, that thing right here is conceptualized differently through these two different ways. And, you know, the animal, of course, comes a big part of that. And let me just mention, too, that, you know, again, another way we can think about how this mythologies have influenced science problematically. Before it was the idea that you had the soul in here, and animals didn't have a soul. And then we got this modern idea coming from Descartes that, no, we have a mind. Descartes was a very religious person. I've read his original stuff. He used the words mind and soul interchangeably. But again, he said animals don't have a mind, or a soul, and he used these words interchangeably. And then modern science picked this up. So when I was a college freshman, you couldn't talk about animal feelings. You couldn't talk about animal thoughts. The idea was that they were just sort of fleshy robots. Like, no, they don't, it's just instinct. And we know now that that is so wrong. But we can see how this was formed and how it really formed a lot of our scientific worldviews around this. So there's a lot to unlearn as we learn from other cultures. There's a lot that we have to unlearn of our own. And that can always be a little uncomfortable for people. A lot of people don't like their worldview to be challenged. Occasionally you do get a little pushback on that. One little aside, because I've talked about ancient Greece, I've talked about ancient Abrahamic stuff. On the other hand, you think about ancient Egypt as kind of an interesting example, because ancient Egypt actually did have a lot of animal deities. It also had a fair amount of people deities. So you can see that the Greek and the Abrahamic and the Egyptian were all kind of going on at the same time at a couple of points. And there were vast differences even then in the old world and the major civilizations. The earlier you go back in Egyptian mythology, the more animal deities you have. And the more you sort of move up into the modern realm, which would have been more contemporary with the Greek and Abrahamic myths, the more that it focuses on people. So again, there's a lot of, I don't want to draw too, divisive a line between Europe and America. There was a lot of sort of mixing and matching going around, especially during that early age. The Abrahamic traditions, even within their own traditions, broke off from the Egyptian, right? They were separate. We are not those guys. And so you could really see that being emphasized, I think, in the Abrahamic traditions, that we don't worship animals, right? We know, right? So this may have actually been formulated sort of in response to the Egyptian traditions of the time.
Tok, I was interested in something that came up as Will was describing your background and your works. And I didn't exactly get the title right, but you had a title, something about the truth of myth.
Yes.
Ring a bell. Okay. That's a big issue for me. I've struggled with this, trying to teach about myth, because you have to crawl over a wall of a certain attachment to that word myth, which means it's something not true. It's a lie. It's an exaggeration. It's a fantasy. And I even see it in the chat. Someone, Odette Springer, has written, yes, I was recently told by a Dene medicine woman that they don't use the word myth because it is their history. It's not a myth. It's not a fake, phony, made up thing. But I believe in the truth of myth and would say that myths are hyper true because they get indirectly at some cosmic truth in the form of a fanciful story, which is, more palatable maybe than an essay would be. So can you speak a bit about that? And then one other thought, just one thing that kind of goes diagonally through a lot of these myths and stories is the family. and that the animals are often referred to as my brother, my sister, my mother, my father, and so forth. So those are a couple of thoughts about myth as you understand it, and then about the family in the Native American traditions.
Yeah, such wonderful questions. Thank you again for hosting me here. I'm going to do this in reverse order. I'll talk about the whole family thing first, if that's okay. So, you know, who is in your group? Who is in your family? Certainly, the idea that the animals are a part of our wider family, we might say, is sort of omnipresent. That it's the family of life, we might say. Also, if you go back to the idea of the vision quest, so these things permeate a culture, and they show up in all different ways. And so think about the idea of the vision quest. The vision quest was supposed to be taken by pretty much everybody. In some cultures, it was only males, but in most of it was like everybody. It was sort of a coming of age thing. Very often, so you would go off from your home community, from your family, you go out in the woods, and then you're supposed to discover your real identity, your adult identity. And this is usually revealed through an animal guardian spirit or some other animal spirit. So this is, you don't have to be a shaman to do it. Everybody's supposed to do this, right? And so everybody has to go listen to animals. They have to receive wisdom in order to be an adult. In order to have an adult name, you have to have received wisdom from a non-human and come back to be able to tell about it. Very often that actually creates your name in many societies. That's your adult name. This is who you are, right? So these things, again, is sort of permeate this idea. And many lineages would be like, you know, or moiety systems, and many groups that these really have a strong sense of your identity, who you are. I'm a raven clan, I'm a turtle clan, I'm a wolf clan, right? So, I mean, your name might be derived from a particular animal. Your family identity might be derived from a particular animal. Your cultural or group identity might be hinged on a particular animal, right? Salmon or reindeer or whatnot. So you can think of all the different ways in which one's identity is formulated through these practices, not just beliefs, but practices. So yes, we are, you know, you are, as an individual in Native American society, you have various relations, one might say, with various groups. So it is a bit like, you know, a big extended family, like where you fit in among all this.
They're almost
yeah.
formal kinship relationships.
Oh, sure. And again, there's so many stories of, you know, animal marriages and, you know, marrying an animal and then producing offspring, and they're very, very redolent. And so in many groups would hold that these are the sort of ethnogenesis of their group, that they come from this time when an animal and a human had babies, and this creates, there's a variety of these. This is really fundamental, again, to get back to that word, for many people's and groups and cultures' identities on all sorts of levels. So yeah, that's a great point to bring out. And again, as a Native American growing up in that, you are embedded in that, and you have special relationships based on your experiences, based on your own experiences with that world. So, and in general, it's up to you to go experience it, right? People don't hand it to you. People don't say, this is going to be your adult name. You are going to be Running Wolf. That's not how it works. You have to go do it, right? So, you know, people have to engage in this and have to learn to listen to non-human others to be a full functioning adult, which is important. So the other part, the truth of myth. Yeah, there's just a book I have out last year, I believe, The Truth of Myth. I co-wrote it with Gregory Schremp from Indiana University. It's meant to be sort of a textbook offering, although anybody interested in myth, it's also meant to be sort of readable by the general public. And what we really try to do is, as the title implies, is to show, as you kind of point out, how myth creates the fundamental categories that we then debate on whether or not they're true. All right. So again, who lies more, men or women? Right. Well, we've already created these fundamental categories that we can lie about, but you know, so this is what creates the categories for truth. So which is true, right? Do men lie more than women, or women lie more from men? We can argue which one of those is true. What we're not arguing over are the fundamental categories as we've constructed them, which have mythic resonance. Again, most Native Americans, all the Native American societies I know, acknowledge more than two genders. So these things do impact our science by creating these fundamental categories that we then debate about. And then the truth of myth, what we're really doing, again, it's a textbook. We look historically, how has myth been studied from the times of the ancient Greeks up till today? We look at a few case studies. You know, in other words, it's meant to be sort of a comprehensive approach to help provide a toolkit for people. So we're not offering like a one size fits all, but rather we're saying, look, you know, some people have done great stuff with euhemerization, where famous people become deified. Other people have done great stuff with, you know, this sort of angle. So there's lots of, you know, mythology has been a very, very rich topic. It brings in people from a lot of different disciplines. And I know I'm kind of coming in as a little of an outsider. I'm an anthropologist and a folklorist, and but it's a big tent. And so what we tried to cover in that book is mythology is a big tent, and it's also supposed to be a core text of an ongoing book series for Oxford University Press. We've got about 3 or 4 books in the hopper already, and we're doing different mythological studies from around the world. I just got notice that the Korean mythology text came in. So this is meant to be an ongoing project that could last hopefully for years and years. And we're really trying to get the study of myth back on a more scholarly, approachable, scientific standing. That could be, then we could have a useful, you know, common shared vocabulary for all sorts of different people to be discussing this and learning from it.
Yeah, that's terrific.
Thank you for that.
Really chimes with my feeling that myths are pragmatic. They're useful things. They maybe have been devalued, and the importance hasn't been recognized as it should be, but there's fantastic stuff there. From any culture you want to look at, there is much to learn, you know, accumulated wisdom that's embodied in the myths. And so they're fantastic. I'm glad you're doing that work. That's great.
Thank you. Yeah, as an anthropologist, for me, like the first thing, if a student comes, he says, I'm researching these people and I haven't heard of them, the first thing I want to know is their myths. What are their sacred creation stories? What are their fundamental narratives? That's the first thing I want to know about a society.
And it's normally the connect with somebody when you travel, you know, and as we run short on time, I want to encourage everybody to continue this conversation on the website. I'm seeing people are now, but before we go, I just can't imagine not hearing what Dennis was going to bring up a moment ago. So Dennis, would love to hear from you, and then.
Yeah, I'll keep it real short because of time. This is a spoke, Toke, off of your wonderful presentation and the comments around it. In getting ready for tonight, I went back to a book that I bought many, many years ago. It's called Biomimicry, and it's by Janine Benyus, Benyus. And the blurb it says, innovation inspired by nature. And the more I listened to you tonight, I realized that she has taken up what I think are indigenous, imaginative ways of relating to the biology of the earth in farming and building. And so anyhow, I was going to read a vignette from it, but I'm not. But I just wanted to let people know it's really right on point with tonight's presentation and discussion. So wonderful.
I actually wanted to jump in really quick here. I had the chance to actually use, I think it was one of the first chapters of Truth of Myth in my anthropology class. And, you know, I think it really, I just want to, be able to tell you directly, Toke. I mean, I think it went really well. I think that particular chapter, I think it's the point of, the starting point. And one thing that I think was, that I like to do is we start a conversation with myth, but then once we get into our folklore section in my class, what I like about folklore is that it takes the familiar. It takes the approach of look around you, listen to the folks around you, and then start from there. And one thing that I think that would help, especially with our students, we want them to be, becoming, impactful storytellers in the world, is the first thing to do is perhaps learn a little bit of listening too. So I know it seems to be some kind of leitmotif in my conversation points here, but I think, any good storyteller, I think, using that, learning from anthropologists, learning from folklorists, a little bit of that training tool of being able to listen to. I think, any good storyteller should learn from, transcription, for instance, or just, any kind of work like that, so I just wanted to, kind of add that in there.
Yeah, there's a lot of great stories out there. A lot of wonderful stories out there, to be sure. There's a whole world of stories out there waiting to be told. If, again, as you point out, if we could be good at listening.
Toke, I can't thank you enough for coming into tonight to enrich what an enriching evening to develop the perspectives. We didn't get as far into talking about the pandemic as I had kind of hoped for, but I certainly see the potential for understanding our relationships as human beings, but really as creatures who are alive and dealing with the world in which we live, and not getting fixed on a particular culture or a gender or a point of view or how things ought to be, but seeing ourselves as part of the process of dynamism. So thank you very much for coming to the Myth Salon tonight. This has been rich and substantive. What we do at the end is the way we began. We're going to go out with a moment of silence. And I really thank you, Toke. Bless you, man. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight.
Marvelous evening. Thank you all. Thanks, Toke.
Marvelous. Yep.
Just
Thank you
terrific.
so much, everybody. Thank you.
Just
Thank you,
terrific.
Toke.
Wonderful.
Thank you both, Dana and Will. Thank you.
Really
Thanks.
been good and sustaining.
Yeah.
Healthy mind food,
Yes.
soul food.
Yeah. Soul food is right. Yeah.
All right. Thank you all. Thank you all. Beautiful, beautiful evening.
Sure was.
Thanks, guys.
Very good, Dana. I had a thought about the pandemic.